Picture this: a dimly lit chamber in a medieval town, its air thick with smoke from the hearth. A woman stands trembling, not because she has stolen, betrayed, or killed, but because she has spoken too boldly, resisted too openly, or displeased her husband. Before her lies not a sword or an axe, but a grotesque object of iron, cold, heavy, and shaped with cruel intention. It is not meant for criminals, nor for rebels. It was designed for wives. These devices, corsets of iron, bridles that pierced the tongue, shackles meant for discipline, were forged not in the service of justice, but of obedience. They did not punish crimes against the state. They punished defiance against men. Wives who argued, who laughed too loudly, who failed to embody silent submission were locked into contraptions that turned marriage into a cage of iron. But why? Why did societies invest so much cruelty into controlling wives specifically? What fears made them craft devices that transformed love and union into silence and humiliation? To answer, we must step back into a world where marriage was not partnership, but possession, and where obedience was enforced not by choice, but by torture. To understand why torture devices were invented specifically for wives, we must first examine the foundation on which marriage itself rested in ancient and medieval societies. Far from being a bond of equals, marriage was a structure of hierarchy. The husband stood at the top, cloaked with authority by law, religion, and custom. The wife stood beneath, expected to obey, serve, and remain silent. This imbalance made her not only a partner, but a subject, and subjects, in the eyes of power, had to be controlled. In Rome, the household was seen as a miniature state, with the husband as its emperor. Roman law gave the paterfamilias, the male head of household, nearly absolute authority over wives and children. Adultery by wives was punishable by death, while husbands were permitted affairs with slaves and prostitutes. Marriage was less a contract of companionship than a transfer of ownership, binding women into obedience to preserve family honor. As Christianity spread across Europe, the Church absorbed and sanctified this hierarchy. Sermons taught that marriage mirrored divine order, the husband ruled as Christ ruled the Church, and the wife submitted as the Church submitted to Christ. Silence and obedience were preached as a wife's sacred duties. A woman who questioned her husband's authority was not just disobedient, she was sinful. This moral weight transformed male authority into something unquestionable, making defiance a form of rebellion against God himself. But religious rhetoric alone could not silence women. Wives still quarreled, gossiped, laughed, and resisted. And so secular and domestic punishments grew harsher. Manuals for husbands circulated, advising corrective discipline for wives who spoke too freely. Some urged physical beatings, others recommended humiliation. Over time, communities formalized this private authority into public punishments. A wife's defiance was not only a domestic matter, but a disruption of social order. The home became a cage, and the town square became its enforcement ground. The roots of this control were economic as much as moral. A wife was often the manager of the household, responsible for food, trade, and family reputation. Her speech carried weight in marketplaces and neighborhoods. A rumor spread by a wife could ruin a man's standing. A refusal voiced at home could disrupt inheritance, property, or alliances. The more influence wives wielded through words, the more men feared losing control. Thus, silencing became a safeguard not just for pride, but for property and power. Cultural stories reinforced this view. Folk tales across Europe mocked shrews, or nagging wives, portraying them as the source of endless trouble. In plays, comic wives spoke too much and had to be tamed by clever or violent husbands. Proverbs spread like law. A woman's tongue is her downfall. The more women talk, the less they work. These sayings transformed speech into rebellion, making silence the only acceptable form of loyalty. The law codified these ideas. By the late Middle Ages, the crime of being a common scold was written into statutes in England and parts of Europe. It applied almost exclusively to women, punishing wives who quarrelled or disrupted the peace with their words. The charge itself reveals the bias. A man who argued was assertive, a woman who did so was criminal. The legal system thus became an extension of the cage, legitimizing punishments that silenced wives under the guise of preserving order. Within this context, it is not surprising that torture devices emerged. If marriage demanded obedience, and if wives defied, then iron became the answer. The iron corset pressed against the body, forcing physical submission. The scold's bridle pierced the tongue, turning words into wounds. Shackles and chains immobilized wives who refused to remain still. These devices were not random cruelty. They were the logical outcome of a worldview that saw wives not as partners, but as possessions requiring discipline. The symbolism of marriage as a cage ran deep. A wife's body belonged to her husband, her labor sustained his household, her words, if uncontrolled, threatened his authority. To chain her was to make the invisible cage visible, to display the hierarchy in metal and pain. Communities did not see these punishments as excessive. They saw them as necessary reminders of the natural order, where silence equaled virtue and obedience equaled survival. It is tempting to imagine that these practices were rare exceptions, the excesses of cruel men. But records suggest otherwise. Ducking stools were constructed in towns across England. Bridles were kept in town halls for regular use. Iron corsets and chastity devices were described in inventories. These were not isolated tools, but systems of control woven into daily life. They remind us that the cage of marriage was not metaphorical, it was enforced in iron. The roots of control over wives, then, lie in a potent mix of law, religion, economics, and culture. Each reinforced the same message. A wife's obedience was essential, her silence desirable, her disobedience dangerous, and when persuasion failed, iron succeeded. The devices invented for wives were not merely punishments. They were declarations of ownership, forged from fear that a wife with a voice might disrupt the fragile hierarchy of power. In this world, marriage was not the sanctuary we often imagine today. For countless women, it was the first cage they were locked into, and sometimes it was the last. When people imagine torture, they often think of dungeons, executioners, and instruments designed to end lives swiftly. But some of the most chilling devices in history were not made for criminals or traitors, they were made for wives. Two in particular, the iron corset and the scold's bridle, were designed not to kill, but to control, humiliate, and transform marriage itself into a theatre of punishment. These were not anonymous tools of the state. They were deeply personal, forged to remind women that even in their own homes, their bodies and voices belonged to men. The iron corset at first glance looked like armor, the kind worn by knights into battle, but its purpose was the opposite of protection. Shaped to fit tightly around a woman's torso, often made of heavy bands of metal, it wrapped her chest and waist in unyielding iron. Some versions were hinged at the back and locked in place with screws or rivets, ensuring it could not be removed without tools. To outsiders, it may have resembled strength, but for the wearer, it was a prison. The corset inflicted pain slowly. The rigid bands pressed against ribs and hips, making breathing difficult. Women forced to wear it for days developed bruises, cuts, and even internal bleeding. Spikes were sometimes added on the inside, digging into flesh with every movement. Weighted versions pulled downward on the spine, creating constant strain. In some accounts, women were made to wear the corset under clothing, carrying their punishment into daily life, cooking, cleaning, walking, and even sleeping while iron constricted every breath. The iron corset's symbolism was unmistakable. The corset, a garment already associated with shaping female bodies to fit ideals of beauty and obedience, became an instrument of discipline. It turned femininity itself into punishment. A wife's figure, once a sign of grace or attraction, became the very site of humiliation. By enclosing her body in metal, society declared that her natural form, her very freedom of movement, was dangerous and had to be controlled. If the iron corset targeted the body, the scold's bridle targeted the voice. Forged from bands of iron that enclosed the head like a cage, the bridle was fitted with a cruel innovation, a sharpened spike fixed inside, pressing down on the tongue. Whenever the woman tried to speak, the spike pierced flesh, producing blood and unbearable pain. Some bridles included multiple spikes, others serrated edges to shred tissue with even slight movement. Bells were often attached to the mask, ringing whenever the woman moved, transforming her silence into a noisy spectacle for all to witness. The bridle's victims were typically wives accused of scolding, nagging, gossiping, or challenging their husbands. In practice, the crime could be anything from criticizing a neighbor to refusing an order. Once fitted with the bridle, women were paraded through town squares, chained to posts, or forced to stand in public while crowds mocked them. The device turned words into wounds, punishing not crime but voice itself. Historical records from England and Scotland detail numerous cases. In 1567, a Scottish woman was sentenced to wear the bridle for quarrelling with her husband. In Newcastle in 1650, another woman was chained in the marketplace with her tongue pinned by the device until she fainted from blood loss. These were not rare incidents, but part of an established practice. Town halls often kept bridles on hand, ready to silence any woman deemed disruptive. The public nature of these punishments was essential. The iron corset might be worn in private, but the scold's bridle demanded an audience. Its bells jingled not for the victim's shame alone, but to broadcast her humiliation to the entire community. The woman became a living warning. This is what happens to wives who talk too much, argue too boldly, or resist too openly. In this way, the punishment disciplined not only the wearer but every woman who watched. Comparisons with male punishments reveal the cruelty of this gendered logic. Men who insulted or quarreled were fined, imprisoned, or challenged to duels. Their speech was considered dangerous but legitimate, something to be met with force or negotiation. Women's speech, by contrast, was criminalized as disorderly, animalistic, requiring muzzling like livestock. The very word bridle comes from horse tack, reducing women to beasts who had to be controlled with iron. Together, the iron corset and the scold's bridle reveal the dual strategy of control. One attacked the body, forcing submission through physical pain and restriction. The other attacked the voice, silencing words through blood and humiliation. Both declared the same message. Wives existed not as partners, but as possessions, whose freedom of body and speech could be removed at will. The devices also reveal a deep cultural anxiety about female independence. The corset punished wives who resisted physical roles, whether through laziness, disobedience, or sexual suspicion. The bridle punished wives who resisted social roles, whether through gossip, complaint, or defiance. In both cases, the fear was the same, that wives might assert power in spaces household, market, community, that men believed should be theirs alone. Even the design of the devices underscored their symbolism. The corset resembled armor, but instead of defending life, it suffocated it. The bridle resembled a mask, but instead of concealing identity, it erased humanity. Each turned familiar forms into grotesque inversions, mocking the very roles women were expected to fulfill. Today, rusted corsets and bridles sit in museums, their cold iron a haunting reminder of how ordinary cruelty can become. Tourists peer through glass, marveling that such things ever existed. Yet these devices were not curiosities in their time. They were tools of daily governance used in towns and homes across Europe to enforce obedience. Their survival as artifacts testifies not only to their existence, but to their normalization. The iron corset and scold's bridle were not designed for war, rebellion, or high treason. They were designed for wives, for the women closest to men, bound to them in law and religion. That fact alone makes them chilling, for it shows that cruelty was not reserved for enemies, but embedded in the most intimate institution of all: marriage. When we imagine domestic discipline in history, we often think of it as something hidden, a private quarrel behind closed doors, a husband asserting control over his household in secret. But in medieval and early modern Europe, punishment did not always stay confined to the home. What began as correction within marriage often spilled into the streets, transforming wives' humiliation into public spectacle. Communities became participants in the silencing of women, turning their punishment into theatre for all to witness. The logic was simple. If obedience was the foundation of marriage, then disobedience threatened not just a husband's authority, but the stability of the entire community. A quarrelsome wife was not just a private problem, she was a public danger. And so towns and villages developed rituals that took the iron devices of domestic control and paraded them before neighbors, ensuring that silence was enforced through shame as much as through pain. One of the most notorious examples was the ducking stool. A heavy wooden chair mounted on a long beam, it was designed to dunk women into rivers or ponds. Wives accused of gossiping, nagging, or scolding were strapped into the chair and plunged repeatedly into cold water while crowds gathered to jeer. Each time the chair rose above the surface, the woman gasped for air, only to be submerged again. The cycle could last minutes or hours, depending on the will of officials or the fury of the crowd. Some women drowned, others emerged half-conscious, their humiliation complete. The punishment was not about justice, it was about demonstration. By drowning a wife's words in water, the community dramatized the idea that her voice was pollution, that needed cleansing. Another common ritual was parading with the bridle. A woman fitted with the iron muzzle was not left in private to endure her pain. She was marched through the streets, bells on the mask jingling with every step, her silence turned into noise. Crowds followed, mocking, laughing, and sometimes throwing refuse. Children learned early what defiance looked like. Wives watching from doorways learned what it cost. The spectacle was not a side effect, it was the point. Public silence became a warning broadcast. Chaining to posts or pillories also turned punishment into performance. Women accused of quarrels or disobedience were locked in irons in marketplaces, forced to stand for hours as neighbors passed by. Some were shackled with signs hung around their necks declaring their crime, gossip, nagging, or disobedience. Others were mocked with symbolic props, such as wooden paddles shaped like tongues or exaggerated masks. The goal was ridicule. Unlike prisons which removed offenders from sight, these punishments placed wives at the center of attention, teaching the community that her suffering was both entertainment and instruction. This transformation of private discipline into public theater reflected the blurred lines between household and community authority. Husbands were granted wide latitude to correct their wives, but when their authority faltered or when a woman's voice disrupted the peace beyond her home, the community stepped in. Courts and councils justified these punishments not as cruelty, but as preservation of order. By silencing one wife in public, they reinforced obedience in countless others. The theatre of punishment also revealed anxieties about power. Gossip, after all, was not meaningless chatter. It could damage reputations, disrupt alliances, and challenge authority. A wife who spoke too freely about her husband's failures could weaken his standing among peers. A group of women exchanging rumors could undermine officials or clergy. Silencing these voices through public humiliation was a way of reasserting control, dramatizing the fragility of male honor and the lengths society would go to protect it. public punishment also carried a ritual dimension. The ducking stool, with its repeated plunges, resembled a twisted baptism. The bridle, with its jingling bells, resembled a grotesque parade mask. Chains and stocks echoed religious penance, exposing sinners before the community. Each punishment was more than pain, it was a moral performance, a sermon acted out in metal and water. Wives were not only corrected, they were made into symbols of disorder, vanquished. The crowd played a central role in this theatre. Neighbours mocked, laughed, and threw refuse, not because they were individually cruel, but because participation reaffirmed their place in the hierarchy. To jeer at a punished wife was to align oneself with order, to join in the collective silencing of women. These rituals bonded communities together through shared violence, making obedience a communal project rather than a private burden. The contrast with male punishments is stark. Men accused of crime were punished for their actions, stealing, fighting, betraying. Their punishments, though brutal, were framed as justice. Women accused of gossip or defiance were punished for their voices. Their punishments were framed as morality, as correction. This distinction shows how gender shaped not only the severity of punishment, but its purpose. Men were corrected for what they did, women for what they said. Over time, the theatricality of these punishments became ingrained in culture. Plays and ballads mocked quarrelsome wives, often ending with images of bridles or ducking stools. Proverbs circulated widely, warning women to guard their tongues. Children grew up watching wives chained or paraded, absorbing the lesson that silence was survival. These public rituals turned patriarchy into performance, ensuring that its message lived on beyond the moment of punishment. And yet some women resisted even in humiliation. Chronicles tell of wives who locked eyes with the crowd while paraded in bridles, refusing to lower their gaze. Others shouted through pain, their words garbled but defiant. In rare cases, neighbors protested, declaring the punishments excessive. These acts did not dismantle the system, but they remind us that even within theatre, agency persisted. Silence was demanded, but it was not always given. In essence, domestic punishment turned public theatre was about more than controlling one wife. It was about disciplining an entire community of women. Every dunking, every bridle, every chain was a lesson staged for the audience as much as for the victim. The pain was personal, the message was collective. Marriage, already a cage, was reinforced by the spectacle of punishment, making silence not only expected but enforced through shame and fear. The iron corset, the scold's bridle, the ducking stool, each of these devices inflicted pain, but their purpose reached far beyond bruises and blood. They were symbols, physical embodiments of an ideology that defined women not as individuals but as property, and silence not as a choice but as virtue. Their legacy endured not just in the iron they left behind, but in the cultural scripts, proverbs, and traditions that survived long after the devices themselves disappeared. At the core of these punishments lay one idea: a wife was not her own. She was the possession of her husband, bound by law, religion, and custom to obey. Her voice, her body, her labor, all were claimed as his rights. To speak against him was not merely disobedience, it was trespass. The devices used to silence wives made this message brutally clear. A bridle transformed her head into a cage. A corset turned her body into property locked in metal. Shackles tied her not to her own will, but to another's authority. Iron became the language of ownership. Silence was the corresponding ideal. Religious sermons exalted the quiet wife, holding her up as the model of virtue. Proverbs echoed the same message. Silence is a woman's best ornament. Literature mocked the talkative wife as a shrew or nag who needed taming. Plays like Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew did not invent the trope. They reflected an existing cultural obsession with silencing. Even art reinforced the message. Paintings of idealized wives showed them with downcast eyes and closed mouths, their modesty written into their silence. These ideals seeped into law. The very crime of being a common scold codified silence as a legal duty. Unlike theft or assault, the offense was not about harm done, but about noise made. The law declared that a wife's words, if too loud or too frequent, disrupted public order. By criminalizing female speech, the law transformed silence into obligation. To be silent was not only moral, but legal survival. Symbolism extended beyond individuals to the structure of society. A silent wife symbolized a stable home. A stable home symbolized a stable community. Thus, silence became more than personal virtue, it became civic necessity. Public punishments dramatized this symbolism. When a wife was bridled or ducked, the act did not merely correct her. It cleansed the community, reassuring everyone that order had been restored. The humiliation of one wife became the guarantee of obedience for all. The legacy of these symbols is visible in the language that survived long after the devices fell out of use. To this day, terms like nagging wife, henpecked husband, or battle axe carry the same logic. That a woman who speaks too much is monstrous, that a wife with a voice threatens male authority. These terms echo the bridle's iron, each insult a verbal shackle reinforcing the ideal of silence. Even humor preserved the legacy. Jokes about wives talking too much became common in folklore and tavern songs. Men laughed at caricatures of gossiping women, their mockery itself a form of policing. By turning the silenced wife into a figure of ridicule, culture ensured that the lesson of the bridle endured even without the device itself. The symbolism also reveals deep contradictions. While silence was praised, women's voices were still feared precisely because they carried power. Gossip could ruin reputations. Complaints could challenge authority. Laughter could undermine dignity. The energy invested in silencing women shows that their voices were never trivial. The very existence of the devices is proof of their influence. If wives' words had truly been meaningless, no iron would have been needed. This contradiction shaped women's identities. They were told their worth lay in silence, yet punished when their voices revealed their strength. They were praised for obedience, yet their disobedience betrayed how much power they actually wielded. The bridle and corset symbolized not just control, but fear. Fear that women could disrupt, destabilize, or resist in ways men could not contain without iron. The legacy of these symbols did not vanish with the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution. Instead, it shifted into subtler forms. In the 19th century, the angel in the house ideal exalted wives who were pure, obedient, and silent. In the 20th century, women who spoke too loudly in politics or business were dismissed as hysterical or unfeminine. Even today, women in leadership are criticized for their tone, their volume, their persistence. The iron bridle may be gone, but the symbolic bridle lingers in expectations and stereotypes. In this sense, the legacy of silence is twofold. On one hand, it reveals how deeply patriarchy embedded itself into culture, turning obedience into virtue and silence into survival. On the other hand, it highlights the resilience of women who resisted. Some spoke even with bridles cutting their tongues. Some laughed even as ducking stools plunged them into water. Others carried their words into stories, songs, and traditions that outlived the iron. The symbols may have been meant to erase them, but in many ways they testify to their endurance. Ultimately, the symbolism of these devices teaches us that torture was not just physical, it was cultural, psychological, and generational. The iron corset and scold bridle were more than tools of pain, they were sermons in steel, declaring to all that wives were property and silence was virtue. Their legacy lives not only in museums, but in words, jokes, and expectations that still shape women's lives today. The haunting truth is this: iron can rust, wood can rot, but ideas endure. And the idea that wives belong to men and that silence is their highest virtue has proven far harder to destroy than any device. The iron corsets have rusted, the scold's bridles hang behind museum glass, ducking stools are reconstructed only in tourist villages. To modern eyes, these devices look like relics of a barbaric past, objects too grotesque to imagine being used on wives in real life. And yet, while the metal may have vanished, the logic behind it has not. The control once enforced by iron now hides in culture, economics, and technology. The devices are invisible, but their effect remains chillingly familiar. Consider the workplace. A man who speaks boldly in a meeting is praised as confident. A woman who does the same is often labeled aggressive or difficult. Her voice is not pierced by spikes, but by stereotypes. She learns quickly that silence is safer, just as her ancestors did centuries ago. Studies show women are interrupted more often than men, their contributions minimized or credited to male colleagues. These are not accidents. They are invisible bridles, tightening with every dismissal, every patronizing laugh. In homes, the same patterns persist. While laws no longer grant husbands legal authority to beat or bind their wives, many women live under financial control, emotional manipulation, or cultural expectations that demand silence. A wife who questions her husband's decisions may not face a bridle, but she may face ridicule, isolation, or threats. Abuse shelters are full of women whose chains were invisible bank accounts locked, movements tracked, phones monitored. The cage remains. It is simply harder to see. The digital age has created new arenas of silencing. Social media promised liberation, a platform where everyone could speak. But for many women, especially those in public life, it has become a new ducking stool. A tweet, a video, a statement can unleash waves of harassment, insults, threats, even organized campaigns to discredit or dox them. The effect is the same as the medieval mob gathered around the town square. The crowd mocks, shames, and terrifies until silence becomes the only refuge. Online humiliation has replaced physical dunking, but the principle is unchanged. Speech is punished by spectacle. Even humor and entertainment carry forward the legacy. Jokes about nagging wives or sitcoms featuring the talkative woman and her exasperated husband echo centuries of mockery. These tropes may seem harmless, but they reinforce the same symbolic message. A wife's voice is excessive, irritating, in need of correction. The iron is gone, but the stereotype is alive. Religious and cultural traditions, too, continue to exalt silence as feminine virtue. In some communities, women are taught from childhood that obedience is holiness and that speaking too much is shameful. Proverbs like, "A woman eat's voice should not be heard outside the home," still circulate across the world. Sermons remind wives to submit, their silence framed as love or faith. The theology that once sanctified bridles and corsets survives, its iron softened into words but no less binding. Even politics reflects these invisible devices. Female leaders face scrutiny not only for their policies, but for their tone of voice, clothing, and expressions. A man who shouts in Parliament is passionate. A woman who raises her voice is unhinged. Debates about likability or femininity replace discussions of competence. The bridle is metaphorical, but the pain of being silenced is real. And yet, resistance endures. Just as some women defied humiliation even in bridles, modern women resist invisible chains. Movements like Me Too broke silence on harassment, proving that voices once shamed into silence can unite into power. Activists, journalists, and leaders reclaim the right to speak, exposing injustices once hidden behind cultural obedience. Their defiance is proof that even the strongest symbolic devices can be broken. Still, the risk of backlash is ever present. Women who speak out against abuse are often accused of lying or exaggerating. Whistleblowers face career destruction. Victims are cross-examined in public opinion as harshly as in courtrooms. The message echoes across centuries: speak and you will pay. Silence is safer. The persistence of these patterns forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Have we truly left behind the age of bridles and corsets, or have we merely replaced iron with invisibility? A modern wife may not fear a ducking stool, but she may fear losing her job, her reputation, or her safety if she speaks too freely. The methods differ, but the goal remains the same: control. To recognize this continuity is not to deny progress. Women today enjoy freedoms unthinkable in medieval times: legal rights, education, political representation. But freedom on paper does not erase cultural memory. The stereotypes that silence women are centuries old, passed down through proverbs, jokes, and traditions. Breaking the cycle requires more than removing devices. It requires dismantling the ideas that built them. Ultimately, the story of torture devices invented for wives is not just about the past. It is a mirror. It shows us how societies rationalize cruelty as order, how they disguise fear as morality, how they turn silence into virtue. And it warns us that unless we confront the invisible devices of today's stereotypes, harassment, expectations, the logic of iron will never truly die. The iron corset and scold's bridle may belong to museums, but their legacy lives in boardrooms, households, pulpits, and screens. To break these modern chains, we must remember what they were always meant to hide. Women's voices are not dangerous, they are powerful, and that is why they have always been feared.